Hey everyone, it's me HawkeyeG, and I'm here with another video for you. Today's video is another campaign army composition guide with demonstrations, this time for Cathay. As of this time, Cathay is now the recommended starter race, and I think that's with good reason, especially in terms of their lower campaign difficulty. However, they do have a good variety of units, including some decent artillery options, which aren't quite as prevalent in other Warhammer 3 races, but whether or not I'd recommend those artillery may be a different story. Now, of course, if you enjoy the videos and are looking forward to more, remember to like and subscribe, and of course leave your own composition suggestions or feedback in the comments below. Feel free to ask any questions there as well. Now, with that being said, let's get into the video. So, for those who aren't familiar with my campaign army composition guides, I'll explain the process here. If you already know how these videos work, go ahead and skip to the next section. The short version of the explanation is that I use the custom battle versus AI in order to set up armies that are of equivalent cost and relatively equivalent strength on normal battle difficulty in a field battle, so we can kind of get a neutral idea of how the armies are. And I pit these armies against an equivalent tech level for the opposing army, and I base the compositions on what would be theoretically possible at different stages of the campaign. The purpose being to showcase these compositions in theoretically equal and balanced fights, which then by means of victory demonstrates how and why these compositions are effective. To get more into the details of how these videos work, I'm going to go to the campaign map for a brief moment to explain. So what I try to do is focus on different settlement levels to talk about the different stages of the campaign. It's a little harder to do this when we're talking about the Realms of Chaos campaign, but I'm not going to worry about that. And of course, Immortal Empires now is finally coming up soon, about a month and a half for us here. So what I do is I talk about things in different stages, right? When you start the game, you usually only have one tech building plus whatever you get from the settlement, so I make a brief note about that. And then I kind of have like an early game, a mid game, and a late game, right? Where early game is when you hit tier 3, you can probably have tier 3 across your settlements. It takes a little bit longer to get to tier 4 because of the added required population surplus and growth required to get there. So when we hit tier 4, we have that's what I consider to have unlocked mid-game, and then tier 5 is endgame, but of course in endgame we're going to essentially have multiple tier 5 settlements, so I kind of remove the restrictions at that time. In the early game, I essentially say that we would have 2 military building slots, and so we'd be able to pick 2 that go up to tier 3 to craft our compositions from, and so we'll be able to select from that. You know, at the very least, you know, it doesn't apply as much to Cathay in Warhammer 3, but in general, the least amount of settlements that you could have is 2 settlements in a province. You know, even if we're playing as Kislev, we're going to be able to capture 1 additional minor settlement, and therefore have access to, you know, 2 economic buildings per slot and 1 military building per settlement by tier 3. So then moving on to mid-game, at tier 4, I would be able to add in an extra slot, like an extra 1 of each, and then at tier 5, again, an extra 1 of each. But in tier 5, we're just going to talk about, you know, theoretically, you have basically everything unlocked, and we'll see how it plays out from there. And then the other part, which I've already talked about a little bit, is that I use the battles option versus AI to demonstrate these. So they're not always perfect, right? It's not necessarily taking into account technology and research, being able to focus on certain units that you like. It's not going to include level ups. You see that I have a Lord Magistrate here in the army, which is not going to do as great in the custom battle, but in the campaign, since I can actually level up their melee stats, they're going to perform a little bit better, so I might recommend them there. But so this is just an example of how this custom battle will differ a little bit from what we would see in the campaign. There's some features that aren't taken into account, but that's also kind of the point, right? We're on normal battle difficulty. We've got an equalized amount of funds available, and I try to set it up so that each army costs almost the same. You know, we're within 100 gold of each other out of 26,000. The point being that this is as close as I can get to a theoretically neutral situation, right? Because we're not taking into account campaign bonuses, faction bonuses, things like that. We're seeing, you know, the baseline of these units versus the baseline of these units without taking into account skill trees or anything else as well. To see and how even in a field battle with no sort of like, with no other advantages or disadvantages, how does one army stack up against another, and then based on the success of those results, that kind of gives an idea of, so why would I use this composition? Where or what situations do I use it in? Is it actually effective, or is it a piece of garbage, right? So those are the questions we're hoping to answer here. This is the method that I'm using in order to answer that question, and that should explain everything you need to know for the guide if this is the first one that you've watched. With that being said, we'll move on to the actual guide, and we're going to have a little bit of discussion about turn 1 and the early game. So I like to start these videos with just a brief little discussion about what I think you should do on turn 1, what the earliest parts of the game look like before we actually settle into tier 3 settlements and have a little bit more options. I think it's become a lot more obvious now that they've added these kind of tier 0 units where you can recruit these units for any faction, even in most factions for Total War Warhammer 2, to just a level 1 settlement, right? You control a single settlement, you're able to get these kinds of units. But I do want to talk about it briefly because as Miao Ying, the northern provinces here, we do actually start with the forge building here, and I'm going to recommend you get rid of it. You get rid of it and you replace it with the basic barracks building. That's what I would do for most factions on a turn 1 anyway. But there's not too much to say, right? We're going to be spamming out peasant spearmen, peasant archers, and as you can afford it, jade warriors. Maybe get some regular unshielded jade crossbowmen in there, just because they are going to have much better armor piercing damage, and they're going to have better armor as well. This is a little boosted, but their base damage should be 9. Now, this isn't a perfect replica of what your armies are going to be like, and in theory, you're going to want to expand it to the maximum size or fill in with as many units as you can, but eventually this is essentially what your early game armies look like. I wish that it organized units correctly here. But you always, so far with the 2 factions we have, you're going to start with some sort of artillery piece. That's really going to be what enables you to just kind of force enemies to bring the fight to you. You'll have, one of your unique, your legendary lords who you can set up how you like, but theoretically you want to be able to get some kind of damaging spells in there, and maybe get an alchemist into the army when you can for a little bit of extra magic power as well. I don't think we need to dwell on the early game for too long. There's, again, like I said, there's not too much to say, and then I ramble on about it for 5 minutes. But with that being said, we're just going to talk about the early game compositions now. So, like I said, this is when we're going to be assuming that most, if not all, of your settlements are at tier 3, and although Cathay doesn't need this limit, I always say that we would have at minimum 2 military buildings for any faction. Theoretically, there could be another Cathay faction that's high. Well, there's not even examples here in these provinces, but just in case we were to start with only 2 settlements, I try to make that a universal rule for these guides. But anyway, if we're talking about having 2 different tier 3 options here as Cathay, we're probably going to be sticking to the basic military. You're still going to want the Jade Barracks. I think the Jade Warriors and Jade Crossbowmen are going to be extremely useful. And in general, in my experience as Cathay, you really want your infantry to be the core of your lineup, right? In the early game, you're spamming out these peasant archers and spearmen, but I don't think that really changes into the late game. Unless we're talking really extended late game and you're spamming out terracotta sentinels, but I still wouldn't even recommend that, right? Your core is always going to be a nice balanced blend of melee infantry and missile infantry. You're going to want to augment it with something else. So in the early game, with our basic military, we kind of have 2 options here. We have the cavalry option and we have the artillery option. So I'm going to be creating a composition where I add cavalry to our infantry, and I'm going to be creating a composition where I add artillery to our infantry. And we're going to see what that kind of composition looks like, and we're going to match it up against an appropriate enemy to see what situations you should use it in and how those kinds of fights play out. Now, I will say, if you do have options for a 3rd slot, because we will have that, you probably want to get a hero building in there. At tier 3, I'm going to have to recommend the alchemist building because you won't get a capacity increase for your astromancer until you get to tier 4. So just something to keep in mind. So the first composition we're going to be looking at here is the infantry with the cavalry augment. No, kitty. So the first option we're going to be looking at here is the melee and missile infantry with the cavalry augment. We're in the early game, so our funds are a little bit lower, and of course we're going up against an appropriate enemy for this kind of fight. I do think that, objectively speaking, The weapons teams and artillery units are strong and can be useful, but frankly, with the current state of settlement battles in the game, where field battles are maybe 25%, settlement battles are like 50% of your battles, and then siege battles are another 25%, I personally would recommend cavalry. I don't really use artillery like I used to, and I think that it struggles with the way that the settlement map layouts work, especially because of how settlement battles work. I would much rather have cavalry going into those maps than artillery. I think for siege maps, maybe you can go either way, but fighting a siege maps of Cathay, you're always at this weird height disadvantage. You can break open the walls, but I find it difficult. It's difficult to get as much use out of artillery as you used to be able to, so I will generally recommend this composition adding cavalry into your armies when playing as Cathay over adding artillery. But that being said, they're still effective. I mean, if you watch Anticity videos, you'll know that Iron Hail Gunners can be really good in field battles. The recent buff to Crane Gunners also made them very strong, and their projectiles appear to pierce units, so they can be pretty devastating to enemy infantry. But the problem is, if you're using, a artillery-focused or range-focused composition, there's downsides to it in sieges, and there's also downsides to it when fighting aggressive enemies in field battles. But that's more of a meta issue with the game. We're here to talk about compositions, so I'll get back to focusing on that. So we have our cavalry army. Again, because of the early game, I like to keep the costs low, keep the compositions a little bit simpler. So we do still have some peasant units here, and in your campaigns in the early game, you will probably have to fill in with some peasant units to spare. But like I said, they're so easily replaceable that this shouldn't be an issue, and in fact, they make for good fodder. Jade Warriors, very strong unit to have. They've got armor, they've got shields, they've got decent melee stats. In fact, they have better melee defense than the Jade Warriors, in case you never noticed that. Or Jade Warriors with halberds, that is. They actually have better melee defense, something to keep in mind. We'll be talking about it again in the future. Of course, Jade Warrior crossbowmen with shields, armored, shielded, armor-piercing damage on their missiles. These are some of your core units for the campaign. We also add in a couple of Jade Lancers because cavalry has high mobility. It's going to be able to pressure the opponent effectively, which we're going to need a lot of in field and settlement battles. And of course, if we're fighting Tzeentch, this is where your cavalry is going to shine. The biggest weakness we might see here is the Screamers of Tzeentch, being anti-large, are going to be able to kind of repel our cavalry effectively, but we're going to want our cavalry to try to reach their pink horrors if we can and do some harassment there, and we should have plenty of units, plenty of our own melee units to defend successfully against their harassment. We talked about it enough. Let's go see a demonstration. So we're starting out here with more or less a checkerboard formation. I've got it pretty spread out, which I usually like to do. I mean, we do see that the enemy has a spread formation as well, and we've got enough frontline units to hold the front line. We're not necessarily trying to build a box, especially because against Tzeentch, we are going to want to put on a little bit of pressure. So we see that they're moving towards us. I want to pull my cavalry back a little bit just so that they don't get shot preemptively. I don't need to lead early charges with my cavalry and instead want to keep them in reserve for flanking. We also see that their units are flying around the side for the flank, so we want to make sure that we're in position for that. We start adjusting archers a little bit to try and get those archers in position to be able to shoot and counterattack their units here. We also want to try and dodge some of their spells if we can, but there's a lot going on. And you can see here's where, when their units are about to reach our cavalry, that's when we send them out. Taking a lot of damage on this front line, and that's one of the biggest difficulties when fighting Tzeentch, is you're going to want to move units around a lot. There's always going to be stuff that's getting focused down, and you have to be pretty careful about your lord getting focused fired by a bunch of pink and blue horrors as well. We're going to see that take some damage right there. But you can see here, we're also starting to push the infantry up to pressure the front lines. In a fight like this, you want to be trying to focus fire some of their ranged units with yours. You can see we're trying to deal with this backline harassment effectively as well. But our cavalry's starting to get around to the backline and get into position to flank. We're able to cast, the Wall of Wind and Fire, getting some spells onto their backline as well. And especially with an army like this, we want to pressure, right? We do want to push their front lines. If we can get our cavalry engaged with some of their missile units in the backline, you're going to see them take pretty devastating damage. We're going to be able to put our melee units on their front line to disrupt their firing, to keep them pinned down. We of course are still taking some damage from a pretty aggressive flank by them. But having eliminated the Furies, all we have left are the Screamers, and if we can pin those down with just a melee unit or two, even the Peasant Long Spearmen are going to do well if they're supported by the other infantry, if they're supported by the Archers. And that's pretty much does it. It looks like the balance of power is still even, but to me it feels like this battle is pretty well won. You know, we got to try to watch out for spells coming in and dodge them as best we can. But despite the balance of power, having pinned down a lot of their, missile units, right? They've got all these pink horrors in the back line that aren't really able to do anything. We're able to cycle charge. We can start getting hits in on their Lord. And that should pretty much do it for this fight. We're not really seeing a lot of missile fire from Tzeentch, and once they stop shooting their missiles, that's when you know that you're in a good place. And kind of focus down the rest of their units, try to dodge some of their more oppressive spells, and that's the end of the battle. So you can see, we took some losses on this Jade Warrior unit that got focused down, some of the crossbows that get harassed, and of course the peasant units are pretty vulnerable, but overall very successful battle with minimal casualties. Now the other composition option that I wanted to showcase is an artillery-based one. We're going up against Khorne here because I can't showcase, Warriors of Chaos or Greenskins or something like that. Really, the cavalry-based one is for going up against missile-based opponents, right? If you're fighting the Skaven or Tzeentch, bring that cavalry composition. But if you're going up against, the Kurgan Warband or the Greenskins, I do think that artillery has a place there. Again, we can't demonstrate against those factions, at least not until Immortal Empires. So for now, we're demonstrating against Khorne, which is really a challenging opponent to go up against in the AI versus multiplayer. But we've got a decent composition here. We don't have access to the Fire Rain rockets until tier 4, so we have to make do with crane gunners and a Grand Cannon. I don't want to bring too much artillery if I can help it. The Grand Cannon, of course, is nice, but they don't have any large units, so its effectiveness will be somewhat limited. The crane gunners are supposed to be very strong, but of course, they're going to be useless if/when Khorne gets into melee combat with us, and it's going to be devastating at that time. I've brought Jade Warrior halberds, which I do like to keep on the one or two on the flanks when we're doing these kinds of fights with an artillery composition. But overall, you want as many Jade Warriors as you can for holding lines. The power of your missile units is going to be focused in artillery, so peasant archers will do fine. And then in order to have enough melee to hold the line, we're going to bring a couple extra peasant spearmen. So let's see how this composition plays out. So when you're going into a fight like this, you can see we've got a little bit more of a box built than we did in the last composition. We want them to come towards us. A couple of things that we want to focus on here. First is that our artillery is shooting on valuable targets. These Bloodletters of Khorne have such low armor that they're actually going to be good targets for us to focus down with the peasant archers. Whereas these Chaos Warriors of Khorne with shields and armor are great targets for your artillery to be firing at. So we're going to try to deal out some damage to them there. Same thing kind of goes for the Crane Gunners, where I want those Crane Gunners to be focusing on some of these heavily armored units, especially the dual weapon Chaos Warriors of Khorne. Those are really going to be threatening. Of course, we see them. I'm kind of just letting them fire at whatever while I'm focused on watching what's going on the flanks. And a little bit of automated targets prioritization. I mean, at this point, I should be commanding it. See, we get some commands going in there now yet to get them focused on the right things, but a little bit of auto fire just so that we don't waste time. Repositioning can be nice too. Trying to set ourselves up for this flank. We get our archer units turned around so that they can start shooting at these Chaos Warhounds, because it really does cause a lot of problems if they can get their units in to start disrupting. See that their front line is coming through and getting shot at by our archer units as well. And we're going to try to lead them a little bit with a Wind of Wall and Fire spell here. Just going to do decent. And this is pretty much it. Like you can see, we get out as much damage as we can. But this is also why I've come to not favor artillery compositions as well. The question is, did we deal enough damage before they reached our front lines to be able to survive this onslaught, right? This cannon unit really going to struggle to output damage at this point in the fight. The archers are going to do okay, but our melee units are not built to fight against their melee units, and so we're not going to last very long in these kinds of fights. Even our Lord taking a lot of damage here. Their Lord on a mount, or even unmounted, able to get straight into the back line, get onto our other hero, and can just cause a lot of problems. It's easy for them to start disrupting your lines. We're going to try to use spells as much as we can to deal some damage, especially to their softer units with our weaker early game spells. But once we start clearing up their flanks, it's really important that we try to get some of our anti-flanking units into position, right? You can see their lord running amok in the back lines is not what we want, so we move to intercept them, pour on the damage, focus fire down the units that are remaining, and without too much more trouble, we're able to push them away. So overall, pretty successful battle. Let that one run out a little bit too, because of course when you're using artillery or range compositions, you can get a lot of kills on the retreat from the enemies that are running away. So you can see here a lot of the damage is cemented into our missile units here, especially our artillery, and we just are using the melee units to survive as much as we can. But overall, pretty good fight. Again, you can see we take a lot of damage on our heroes and our melee units, so this is the kind of composition where you're going to need to be replenishing some of these melee troops as you go along, and maybe taking an extra turn or two to make sure that your hero and lords are staying in good shape. So that does it for our early game compositions. 2 different military buildings at tier 3. We kind of see what some of our options are for the troops that we can bring into battle here. I think that crane gunners have a niche here, but I don't know if that niche lasts forever. It can just be tough. Once there's more units on the field, it can be tough to make use of them, especially once your enemy gets better, like high damage, high mobility troops. And so we'll talk about that more when we get there. For now, we're going to jump back to the campaign map, discuss how we're going to modify our compositions going into the mid game. So going into the mid game, we're going to be up to tier 4 on any of our buildings. And we're going to have room for a 3rd military building in any province or any starting composition. We are still, of course, going to have the barracks, and whether you've gone the cavalry or artillery route, you'll be keeping that building. So, of course, the cavalry route doesn't really grow here, but the artillery route does get an extra option for us here. We do technically get access to Celestial Dragon Guard, but I think that those are too expensive at that stage of the game. You want to wait until you can convert more of them over to having both Dragon Crosswoman and Dragon Guard. We also would have access to the Wuxing War Compass, and I'm not sure how to feel about it. The Cathay campaigns that I've played were mostly completed before patch 1.2, and in patch 1.2 they changed... Please let me see it. They changed the way that the spells here work to be limited, like bound spells with limited uses, rather than drawing on the winds of magic. So I frankly have not experimented with these too much. I think that there is room for them in your armies. I could see it as an addition to either type, right? Bringing 1 or 2 of these for just some free bombardment spells in the artillery lineup. It's really going to help your melee units survive against their stronger melee units, and if you're bringing the cavalry lineup, this is going to help you target down some of their surplus ranged units, right? So that's kind of what you would use this for, but we're not going to see that in my compositions. I just haven't used it enough and I'm not familiar enough with it. So yeah, we don't even necessarily need a 4th or a 3rd building, right? We could get this alchemist in a tier 3 settlement anywhere. You might still want the Celestial Observatory, because then we can unlock astromancers, and so we're going to see those in our compositions. And again, artillery will have a new unit in it, but more importantly, in the mid game, you just want to make sure all of your units, like by now you should have no more peasant units, right? You would recruit peasant units if you're building like an extra safety army for defense or something, and you barely have the funds to scrape together. But more importantly, you just want to make sure you have as many Jade Warrior crossbowmen with shields, Jade Warriors with shields. You want to get as much of that as you can. So let's go and look at the compositions for mid game and the matchups we'll see there. So as you can see, one of the advantages to the cavalry composition is it's pretty cost effective. We have increased the amount of funds that we have, and I've put a Lord Magistrate in here, and I did put him on his warhorse for a little bit of extra mobility. In the campaign, since you can upgrade their stats, I think that they get really strong, and for me personally, because we already have 2 spellcasters, I have a hard time convincing myself to bring a 3rd, right? Like, we can get a dragon-blooded lord, but we don't have any other line holder heroes, right? We only have spellcaster heroes, so I like to bring the line holder lord. That's just for me personally. But you can see we have a full assortment of Jade Warriors with shields. We have a full assortment of Jade Crossbowmen with shields, and we have a good amount of Jade Lancers, and we're still under my new revised cost. If we compare that to the Tzeentch army, you can see that they are going to kind of have some trouble with that. Now, this probably isn't the perfect composition for them to have, but again, just following some of the rules that I have set up, you know, having them bring Forsaken, which I do see a lot, a couple of Chaos Knights of Tzeentch, which allows for them to get some flanks. And I'm not sure what else I would bring with them. Maybe I'd put some Spawn of Tzeentch in there instead, if I wanted to be able to see them afford more. But this is the one we've got set up. They, of course, have some good spellcasters. They do have some good missile units. That's where our shields are really going to come into play, and the armor just in general. Even our Jade Lancers have shields. So you can see this is going to be a pretty one-sided fight. We've just got the right composition to go up against a Tzeentch army that looks like this, and cost-wise, we're in a good place. They don't even have all their spells on their Lord, though I did give some of them mounts, because by this point in the mid-game you would have the mounts. So we do have a little bit of a threat. We have essentially Burning Chariot spellcasters, so let's see how this matchup plays out. So here again, with the intent to move more aggressively, we've got a wider formation. We've got more cavalry, so we can start moving out on the flanks a little bit wider. They do send their cavalry out to us. Of course, they get this bombardment spell, which I'm too busy microing my cavalry to dodge. But they're already pushing in with the Forsaken. They're moving up with the Pink Horrors. But you can see if we spread out our warrior or our Jade Lancers a little bit, we can get some really nice flanks on these Chaos Knights. They are going to be able to beat our Jade Lancers, but we just need to try and support them either with some melee units or a little bit of archer fire if we can. However, you can see I'm mostly focused on the front lines here. Again, what I talked about with, and this is why I like having the Lord on a mount, you can see I'm spam clicking trying to get him out of there, and he's barely going to make it. Maybe having him mounted makes him an easier target to shoot at, but if you fought Tzeentch, you know that this is the situation regardless. They just get lambasted. We see the Forsaken come in, we push up and put our melee units on the front lines, and you can see this is why I always try to move offensively with a composition like this, because we do have one of our melee units on their Pink Horrors in the back line. Even with, we've got an Astromancer, and I put him on the compass, and you just saw that comet land in their back line. It's the kind of stuff I use it for. This is also where we need to start running around with our heroes a little bit. We need to get somebody in position to catch this Forsaken, but their front line of Forsaken is already gone. After taking that archer fire on the way into combat, puts them at a disadvantage, and then afterwards we just have a bunch of melee units that are freed up. Who knows what the heck I'm microing right here. Maybe I'm trying to sort out the cavalry stuff, because I'm not really here we go. Because I'm not really moving the front line in, where when we have this big opening, that's exactly what I should be doing. I'm just trying to catch this Forsaken flank. You can see that with them bringing this cavalry, you know, they've got some high-tech cavalry here that's kind of beating our Jade Lancers, so at best our Jade Lancers are holding them down. We're going to take a lot of damage on those Lancers, but personally I find that to be better than the Lancers getting in the back line and devastating the Archers, and we've just obliterated their front lines so thoroughly that we're able to clean up. Balance of power doesn't look that great. We're going to take a lot of damage on these Jade Lancers, but these Chaos Knights are just going to be so vulnerable once they do get into combat, and with our melee units getting on top of their ranged units, the balance of power shifts in our favor quite dramatically, quite rapidly, and so we do win the fight. Now in the results, you know, again, our Lord takes a lot of damage, probably needed to get him out of there sooner. We take some damage on our melee units, but fighting Tzeentch, that's just unavoidable. They're going to use that Doombolt bombardment, they're going to be throwing a lot of spells at us. Probably could have preserved some of the health on the Jade Lancers better, but you can see that the sacrifice of the Jade Lancers means that the crossbowmen are able to survive a little bit better, so could pull back a little bit with the Lancers and use them to countercharge the enemy cavalry, but overall I'd say that this was a pretty good outcome. It calls it a Pyrrhic victory, but I think that this is fine. We're going to have to spend maybe a little bit of time resting and recuperating, but even just merging together and recruiting like one Jade Lancer, one Jade Warrior, by the time that's done, we move on with our life and we're good to go. Now the other composition that we're going to look at here is of course the artillery augment. Again, we can see that we can still afford a full set of Jade Warriors with shields, full set of Jade Warrior crossbowmen with shields. We're at the same funding level, and we're going up against Khorne. Again, the artillery composition is what I think that you should use against more, you know, melee infantry heavy armies and opponents. Even with their cavalry, we kind of have the tools to deal with that. Now, I had to play this one out a few different times. Well, I had to revise this composition a lot. You'll see that we don't have crane gunners, but I just don't think that the crane gunners do enough damage. It's too hard to position them, and like they can get good damage value, but once the enemy gets on top of them, they're useless, and they die really quickly and really easily. Even bringing more artillery I found to not be the answer here, where usually in other games, if you're struggling, the answer is in fact more artillery. I think part of the problem is we just don't have any line holding heroes. We don't have Empire captains. We don't have dwarf lords. So it's really difficult to pin down the enemy in a way that's effective for our artillery to get as much value. Fire rain rockets have a very low ammo count, which is another big issue that we face here. Grand cannons are good, but their fire rate is too slow, and we don't have enough priority targets to be firing at with the cannons. So it's a difficult time. I like I said, I had to revise my artillery compositions theories several times in order to get to a point where I could showcase a decent battle against this same army that I was actually satisfied with. But so in the mid game, we're bringing 1 cannon, 2 fire rain rockets. You're likely to face a lot of melee infantry at this stage of the campaign yet. We may see some large units, and the cannons will be good against that, but ultimately we still have the Jade Warrior crossbowmen with shields who have decent range, really good missile damage, and good enough armor piercing that we're just going to want to focus fire those kinds of targets with our crossbowmen instead. So these are the compositions we're looking at. Let's go into battle and see how it plays out. So once again, with our artillery focused composition, where we're focusing on the enemy coming to us, we've got a little bit more of a box set up with our infantry, melee infantry around the outsides, missile infantry on the insides, and we have only our Grand Cannon is in range of their troops, so we're going to focus fire it on the spawn of corn, of course, trying to get some damage on their large units. And since they're playing defenders, they're going to take a little bit of the damage. If anything, it just kind of shows, like, if we're bringing this artillery and they're still looking at it and going, yeah, we can ride this one out, it's maybe a sign that your artillery isn't quite as strong as you want it to be. Our fire rain rockets are going to start firing, but you can see the AI is really good at dodging in Warhammer 3. That's another one of the factors that I consider, which is why I don't really favor artillery anymore, or at least not like I used to, certainly not for Cathay. You can see it's hard. We want to still focus. We have the same rules for our artillery as we did last time, where the artillery should be focus firing down shielded, highly armored targets. The cannons were trying to stick onto these large targets, and you can see it is kind of disrupting their formations and slowing their approach. Same thing here with the archers, where we rotate our archers so that they're shooting outwards, trying to deflect their units. We really need to catch these flanks. It's much more important when we have this amount of artillery. We're going to hopefully catch their lord as he comes in. Maybe a little bit of archer focus fire would have been good there too, but we're still trying to deflect these flanks. We want to make sure we don't break formation too hard here, but it's going to be tough because you can see with the AI's level of micro, they're going to be able to get around and hit us on the flanks. Here's where their units get in range for us to start casting some spells. We do get a little bit of damage out on their Herald of Corn. And we just kind of are trying to let these artillery do whatever they can wherever possible. I mean, yeah, what a great shot. Look at all that damage we're doing to this Chaos Warriors of Corn with this Fire Rain rocket, even within a reasonable range for them to have good accuracy. It's just depressing. It's depressing, and it's a struggle. We're already at half ammo, so even with the damage output that we have, we're still losing some amount of balance of power, but overall it looks like it's going well. Again, one of the problems with these melee enemies is when they get on... It's the same thing that happened with us fighting against Siege. Huge whiff on the comment there, by the way. Nice. When your melee units get on top of enemy ranged units, despite what the balance of power may say, those enemy ranged units have lost a lot of their value immediately. It's not reflected in the balance of power, but you can see it reflected in the way that the battlefield is going. You start taking a lot of damage on your front lines, your flanks start to collapse, and you just have to hope that you've done enough damage in that pre-fight in order to hold them at bay. You can see my lord dies just trying to fight their lord off and almost managing it. Our front lines begin collapsing, but we have done just enough damage. Well, we haven't quite done enough damage yet. You can see I'm constantly having to kind of pull back, reposition, use whatever melee units I can to hold the lines, and get a couple more spells cast. Despite the balance of power, you can see that a huge portion of our units are currently routing, and so this is the struggle that I find with the artillery composition. Is it's really difficult to, you know, you have to do enough damage on the way in, and with the way the AI functions right now, dodging your artillery fire and being able to just get on top of you and flank effectively, it's really difficult to do that amount of damage. But despite the fact that we're scattered, our formation is shattered, and we're spread out, we are going to finally rally, and we should have just enough firepower from across our different archers to be able to focus down some of the weaker units, get the rest of them to rout, and once we finally deal with their hero and get him off the battlefield, that is the end of the battle. So yeah, we win the fight, and again, I had to rerun this. I had to remake this composition in different ways and replay this battle several times until this was what I considered the best result to be able to show people. I really think that artillery struggles in this game. Here we have a perfect example of it. I do also think that Cathay suffers a little bit in the mid game. They don't have as much of a power spike at tier 4 as we would like to see. You know, you can see, like, even compared to the crane gunners from last time, this fire rain rocket doesn't get as much value as a crane gunner, and we're basically getting as much value on the crossbowmen. Some of these crossbowmen have better value than the artillery. Like, why am I bringing the artillery then? You should just bring one grand cannon. Anyway, I'm going on a whole rant. I have found, and this is in a field battle. This is in a field battle where artillery is going to function the best. Now imagine we're in a settlement battle and you have terrible sight lines and the AI still is dodging like crazy while you're trying to force all your infantry down narrow city lanes. Yeah, it's a joy. You can tell I've had a lot of fun with it. So we won this fight. We struggled with it a lot. We took a lot of damage across the board. Honestly, fighting Khorne in these verse AI matchups is a nightmare, but I didn't want to do a cop-out, and, you know, for Kislev I fought Nurgle a lot, and that is just it's so much easier to fight Nurgle than it is to fight Khorne, but I wanted to show that it's still possible as well. You know, we make it out with our artillery in good health, which is probably the most difficult thing to recover. Of course, it sucks that our Lord died, but man, the AI, whether it's Khorne or Tzeentch, is really good at focusing them down. So that can be difficult to deal with. But we have a victorious outcome. Maybe that's all you can ask for here. That's all I was able to produce myself. But yeah, just your quick reminder that 2 of these 700 cost crossbowmen with shields outperformed the Grand Cannon and one of the Fire Rain rockets. Only the other Fire Rain rocket actually did more damage than the average Jade crossbowman. So yeah, the numbers don't lie. It's tough. It's tough to justify artillery. Like I said, in past games, the answer is more. If your artillery composition is struggling, you go with more artillery. If you look at my Dwarf and Empire guides and you look at the late game compositions with artillery, you'll see that that's how it works out. But yeah, in this game, bring a very small number of artillery pieces and don't rely on them to do the damage that you need to be done. Now, with that ranting and complaining out of the way, we're going to move on to the next step. We're going to look at the couple of endgame compositions and how we can implement some tier 5 units. So let's go back to the campaign map and look at that. So we are at tier 5. Again, like I said, theoretically, we're just going to work with anything that's available. There's no more restrictions on the number of building slots that we have. If we wanted to, we could bring multiple heroes. We're going to unlock new cavalry units, the flying great longbow riders. We're going to implement celestial dragon units into our compositions because we can afford them. And these are also like very clearly S tier units. Shielded, armored, anti-large, armor-piercing missiles. Like, you want this. There's no question about it. We will also unlock terracotta sentinels, which I should use more, but they're just so expensive that I don't have a lot of practice with them in campaigns. I shouldn't say I've struggled to find a practical role for them, but I just haven't felt that I've needed them, especially when you have Celestial Dragon Guard. And we also will unlock the Sky Junk. I just went on a whole rant about what I think about artillery and the struggles that it has, and I don't think that the Sky Junk is necessarily different than that, but at least it doesn't have the abysmal ammunition that the Fire Rain rocket battery has, and it is flying, so it has a bit of a height advantage. We'll at least see how it's available to us as an option, and we'll go from there. So let's look at the compositions. So we've got a new fund limit. We are in the late game, and of course that means the enemy gets to bring late game units too. If we're looking at Tzeentch, we're going to have an extra hero of theirs in there. They're going to have access to a lot of spells. They're going to all be on Burning Chariots. They're going to have another Burning Chariot in the mix. We're bringing some Lords of Change because these are going to be a sincere threat to us and really be able to disrupt us. Same things with the Doom Knights. The Soul Grinder is going to force us to move on them. And of course, they're bringing a bunch of pink horrors to just obliterate us once they get in range. So as a result, we are going with just a hardcore stack. And this is really what I love to see. The fewer variety of units you can put into an army, the easier it is to micromanage all of it. That's one of the key aspects of this game. When I play my campaigns, I always end up overfilling with like, well, one of these, and what if I put a Terracotta Sentinel in here? And it just gives you an extra thing to think about or worry about, and I don't think that's necessary here. We've got a solid line of the melee and missile infantry that has carried us through every encounter thus far, and now we have the Great Longbow Riders, and we're going to bring a bunch of those because they're going to be very effective. These are also a unit that I didn't talk about much, but we can't underestimate them. Heavily armored and shielded. How does everything in Cathay have shields? When's the last time you saw any sort of cavalry unit that's effective that has shields? It's crazy. They're mostly a charge unit. They don't have great staying power in combat, but you'll see that they'll identify a lot of things as minimal threat. And again, of course, we have really solid infantry corps. Same setup with the Lord and Heroes. Let's go see how the replay goes. So with this composition, we're a little bit more in a checkerboard formation. Got the flying longbows right on top. But again, with the cavalry augmented composition, you do want to focus on pressuring the enemy. Now, for some reason that I will not try to understand, they decided to send out all of their little units here, right? Everybody's on a Burning Chariot. I mean, I guess why not? A little bit of healthy dodge on the Lord for once, which is really nice to see. But they start pulling their units into range, which means they're in range of our missile units. This is like the dream scenario. Even though we're on an offensive push type composition, the enemy moves into us. Now, we're able to get heavy damage on the Burning Chariot. Probably going to land a little friendly fire on our Great Longbow Riders, but if I can pin down some of their units, I really want to do that. And in the meantime, we're just kind of trying to adjust our formation while we cycle charge in the Longbow Riders, put our missile units in range, cycle charge Longbow unit riders, move our infantry formation up a little bit. We don't want to lose the formation too heavily, but you can see we just get some excellent damage right there. Lord, almost dead. That Burning Chariot, nowhere to be found. And they finally send out the Doom Knights, but it's kind of the same thing, where we can just get some more fire on them from our archers, and our Longbow Riders, again, are just going to be able to run right into those. And we're taking some damage over here, but Longbow Riders are some pretty healthy units. You can see, despite the damage on this one, we still have 16 models left, and they're really doing their job, right? At this point, we've held at bay a lot of their charge. Now, they send out the Lords of Change, and these are definitely where your flying Longbow Riders struggle. The reason that we bring this flying cavalry is mostly to disrupt their backline. So this fight has not gone the way that you'd expect it to, but so now they're down another hero. They launched the Giant Bombardment spell on a Dragon Guard that they've already Doom Bolted, which you really can't ask for more than that. It really sucks to be these guys, but for the overall health of our army, that's pretty much the dream. And they finally have realized, hey, maybe we shouldn't have charged them for no reason. So we start getting some more shots on them, but this is the point where we're just kind of trying to push up slowly. We want to be careful not to let them get too many free shots on us, but if they're still focusing on the flyers instead of blasting our Lord like they always do, that's kind of nice. But now we're in range, right? They've got these Forsakens still. Those are not going to do anything. Hit a nice comment on their pink horrors. We don't really get the dodge off here, but now we've got pink horrors isolated on the flanks, so we can go in on it with the Longbow Riders. The Lords of Change finally move in. We can focus that one down, hopefully pretty easily. but their units are taking a lot of damage. We want to use our long Marauders to help countercharge some of their flanking units when we can. You see that Doom Knight dove in on our backline, but it's already getting routed. To take a Doom Bolt on the Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen. But just in general, right, we've got a couple of pink horrors tied down in the back line. We get a nice little lightning bolt hit on their lord, put him into a wounded state, and it's just about trying to keep your heroes and your lord and your missile units alive during this phase, while also trying to pin down stuff like the Lord of Change, anything that's able to kind of run away effectively like this and avoid attack. Their Soul Grinder's out of ammo finally, so he had to come in and try to get into combat. Of course, we're going to get hit pretty hard with this bombardment towards the end of the game, but our Long Marauders are still in pretty good health. We're going to be able to bring them back to the front lines of our own and help support what's here. Lords of Change are bleeding out. The Soul Grinder, really low damage, and it's going to charge into some Celestial Dragon Guard. We've got our Archers still fairly safe in the back line, and that pretty much does it for this fight. So once again, here we see, even without the artillery, we're still taking a lot of damage on our melee front lines. It's tough to avoid this, and frankly, fighting against Tzeentch, you're just going to take so much magic damage. Our Lord, of course, gets focused down as well. That's just another hard thing to avoid. I guess we should just be running him around the whole fight. Of course, I do think that with some items and some upgrades to some of his other stats from, his actual skill tree, he can be more effective. But this is what we're going to see, even if we're, maybe if we put a Shugengan Lord on a flying longbow of their own, they'd have a little bit more maneuverability and survivability. So I think that is an argument for the Spellcaster Lord as well. But you really got to try to keep them out of combat. But the Lord Magistrate, maybe you put him on foot once you get some more of those skill upgrades and can survive a little bit better. But overall, still a pretty good fight, right? This is a serious army. This is an army with some very serious damage potential, and they're basically all dead. Both Lords of Change dead. Burning Chariot, two heroes and a Lord, all dead. We took some damage on our Celestial Dragon Guard, which is unavoidable, but the damage that we dealt is just massive. Even the Soul Grinder is down, so that's a good fight. Now, for our last demonstration, we of course have the artillery composition. We've got the Sky Junk, and we're bringing some cannons. The Sky Junk having the ability to, they're going to get like a good angle. I've leveled them up a lot because of the cost of this army just doesn't compare where, we have some extra funding left over. We can, of course, spend some upgrades on this Corn army, but being 400 apart on 26,000, I don't feel too bad about. But the Sky Junk needs it. You need the accuracy on these units. The cannons could use it as well, but we'll see how the effectiveness fares. The reason that I'm bringing a couple of Longma Riders here is because otherwise the Sky Junk are vulnerable. Now, I don't think we have anything in this Corn composition. There is a Bloodthirster. There's not too much here to threaten us. Of course, they have an Exalted Bloodthirster Lord as well, but you want to bring some Longma Riders to be able to directly contest anything that, like any flying unit that can directly aggress against the Sky Junk, right? If the enemy has a Burning Chariot and we don't have Longma Riders, if the enemy has a Bloodthirster, like you want... Those things are going to beat a Sky Junk in a one-to-one fight in the air, and you don't want to hope that your archers can shoot it down in time. You want something to be able to fight or pin down those things that are in the air. So we bring the Longma Riders for that. We've got my typical Corn Tier 3 composition, so let's take a look and see how that plays out. I, of course, didn't mention it, but we also have converted over entirely to Celestial Dragon Guard. Oh, and that's right, I must have not shown this in the composition. We swap over to some Terracotta Sentinels, because this is the kind of situation where we want that, right? The Terracotta Sentinels are the hero unit, the frontline hero unit that we've been missing, right? Yeah, that's where the money goes. We downgrade the Sky Junk, we build in some Terracotta Sentinels. I knew there was something I was forgetting. And we got a nice tight box here. Sky Junk can sit right above the cannons. The Longma Riders can sit on the flanks. The Terracotta Sentinels, the aim will be to pin down units in the front line, giving our Sky Junk really easy targets to shoot at. We're going to try to hit some of their single entities with these cannons, and as much as I've talked about how cannons have good accuracy in the past, they kind of don't. They kind of suck. We whiff a couple of shots at their Bloodthirster, we whiff a couple shots at their Blood Shrine, and I realize I guess we just need to focus the monstrous infantry, some of these mobs. You can see once we start targeting the right units, we are really dishing out some pretty serious damage. These Minotaurs, just taking a lambasting, and that's actually going to be really good because those are going to be one of the strongest units that are going to heavily threaten us. Eventually they do take enough damage, forces them to move. Our Skyjunks do, wow, that was great. Great damage. That's surely going to help us. And but that's what we got to use. Now, fortunately, we actually have some good units in the Dragon Crossbowmen. We can focus down their Bloodthirster Lord a little bit. And pray that the Skyjunk will get a little bit of splash damage. And we do have to adjust our units for this incoming flank. We got at least one crossbowman looking to the side. Yeah, we can focus down this Bloodthirster Lord and eliminate that right at the start. That's pretty lucky. Once the flank moves in, we want to try to charge out and meet it. We don't want them to slip through to the center to get to the Dragon Crossbowmen, but with everything that's happening, it's pretty tough to avoid. Send the Lord out to start tanking on the Bloodletters, and also send these Terracotta Sentinels out to try to hold things at bay. But you can see this is the challenge. Oh, that was weird. This is the challenge of having this kind of artillery composition. Is eventually the enemy gets onto your lines, and suddenly half of your army becomes practically useless, right? Like this Skyjunk, who knows what the hell that's shooting at. We got a cannon still targeted on the Minotaurs that are retreating. I should just reposition these. But the fear is that the cannons will just do friendly fire. The Skyjunk's also notorious for friendly fire. We at least have these Terracotta Sentinels here to hopefully alleviate that problem a little bit, give these Skyjunks something to fire on. But the cannons aren't really useful at this range anymore. You can see my Alchemist running across the field trying to escape this Cultist, not really having much success. We at least have the Longbow Riders to try to pin down some of their units. Really would help if I get the Dragon Guard on here. Yeah, there they go. And just kind of hoping that our front lines don't collapse too much. Really nice comment of Cassandora. Terracotta Sentinels also make for great bait for your spellcasters. We are losing pretty heavily on this left flank. We've also killed off and dealt some devastating damage to some of their more important units. Our Lord being back out means that he's getting chased by a couple of enemies, but we can bait them into these Dragon Guard, catch them as they run. That's really nice. We definitely could have used with some pullback or some repositioning here to try and get these crossbowmen out, but just trying to keep my heroes alive, trying to cast spells on some of these Terracotta Sentinels and the stuff that they're fighting, keeping them buffed so that they can survive, because you can see he's losing slowly to this Bloodthirster with the help of the Bloodletters, so he's going to need, you know, a buff or some damage dealt there. And yeah, just trying to keep your units alive and keep the formation from collapsing. It's honestly hard to work out what's happening here. It's hard to see what's happening. And again, you can see this is where Skyjunks kind of become a little bit less useful. I can maybe get them shooting at some of these units fighting the Terracotta Sentinels. Cannons are all but useless here, and in fact are mostly routing. Their ability to flank and put pressure on us has put most of our archers on the route. But we are still dealing enough damage, and couple of little extra shots. Terracotta Sentinel slips away just at the last second, but we are able to finish off that the Bloodthirster with our Dragon Guard. Overall, another really tough fight. Again, Khorne's just a tough matchup if you're going with this kind of formation. Heavy damage on a Longbow Rider, damage to our heroes, good deal of damage to our melee front line and our missile units, and we lost a Terracotta Sentinel. Do we get good damage? Let's see. I actually don't get a lot of value out of these Celestial Dragon Crossbowmen, which is really kind of sad. We get a lot of value out of the Dragon Guard, as a matter of fact. So the Skyjunk, you could see, there's probably an argument for that being able to, especially combined with the Terracotta Sentinel. The cannons didn't get a ton of value, but their value's all against these Minotaurs of Khorne, which is just going to be one more monstrous infantry charging right through our front lines to hit the back lines. And yeah, it's tough for the Dragon Crossbowmen to get a lot of value when they're constantly being harassed by melee units. So overall, I think this is a tough matchup. I could even see an argument for dropping some of these crossbowmen in favor of more melee units. This is another fight that I had to, you could see I didn't even have my original setup saved, where I had to swap out into Terracotta Sentinels and drop some of these Dragon Guard. But overall, not the best fight of all time. Pretty tough. It's hard to come out ahead on these Khorne fights, but still a win. And again, this goes back to what I say at the start, where we're not taking into account campaign bonuses and effects. We're not taking into account research. We're not taking into account Lord skills. So if you want this kind of army and you build for it from the start, you're definitely going to have a little bit more effectiveness. And of course, the AI isn't going to have a hand-picked army built to harass and pressure you at the same time, so you might have a little bit of a better fight than this. Hopefully this was a good enough demonstration to understand that this is still viable. It just gets so chaotic though, and it can be tough to manage and not too tough to recommend, but just some things to keep in mind there. That does it. We've gone through all the compositions. I don't make enough use of Terracotta Sentinels or Woojing War Compasses, I think, and part of that is just because by the time we get to this point in the late game, I'm already not focused on making that building. You can see Terracotta Sentinels definitely have some value, have a lot of value in the late game as a line holder, and the ability for them to pin down targets for your artillery to shoot at. They're good units, but I haven't practiced with them enough. Same thing with the Woojing War Compass. The change to their spells from costing Winds of Magic to being bound spells, really big, and could probably have gotten some value in that fight, but of course that requires your line holders to actually hold the line. Maybe we drop a couple of Dragon Crossbowmen and throw a War Compass in there, or maybe 2 instead. But hopefully that gives you some ideas to work with. Compositions show you things can get chaotic, but with focus on the right kinds of targets and some spell casting, you can still come out ahead. I do think that the cavalry compositions are favored in Warhammer 3 at this time. I think we're on patch 1.3 right now as of the making of this video, so that's where my strengths lie, especially when it comes to settlement battles, but I think we've talked about that enough. I really hope you've learned something. I hope this video was useful to you. I do like making these videos. Of course, if you did like the video yourself, please like and subscribe. And if you have any comments on what formations you use, I'd love to hear about them. Tell me what your favorite unit in the Cathay roster is and how to use it. Feel free to criticize any of the decisions I've made. We're all going to get better if we learn together as a community. And of course, if you have any other questions or anything that you want to ask me, leave that in the comment section below yourself. With that being said, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.